6, 2003, so over 20 years ago, I received a call from my dad that told me that my husband of almost 10 years was found dead hanging from the rafters of our garage. My husband, Woody, was not depressed. He had no history of depression. He had just started his dream job with a startup company a few months prior.
So just to go back to the HIV era, there were patient groups that were finding drugs that were potentially quite effective in treating some of the AIDS symptoms, these pneumonia symptoms and so on. And the FDA was very slow to approve them. And they'd say, well, look, there's no randomized trial. They haven't done rigorous work. And there was a tremendous pressure by patient groups then for the FDA to move more quickly. And so there's a trade-off here, right? So do they protect patients by not approving a drug until they have a huge amount of data? Or in the meantime, they're harming patients. If the drug turns out to be quite good and necessary, then they've harmed a lot of patients who didn't have access to it in the meantime. So fundamentally, there's this where there's a balancing act. There's some drugs and some that really should be approved earlier that take longer to approve than was needed, and other drugs that stay on the market harming patients long after the evidence is accumulated. They should be pulled or should be at least some black box warning. And a competent FDA would do that balancing act. It's not they would ever get it perfect because I don't think it's possible, but they would be much more reactive when evidence accumulates that a drug is harmful afterwards.
I actually met with the head of FDA right after Woody and told them the story along with other families. And they literally said, well, you're just an anecdote. They called us an anecdote. The head of that division said, well, these are anecdotes because we didn't see it in the clinical trials. And I'm like, wait a minute, that means you look at us as data points. And in my, I'm not a scientist, you are. But in my, when you have a bunch of anecdotes, aren't those data points at some point when they're real people's lives that are happening, right? And so I remember, that was kind of a aha for me, is how they view anybody who comes forward with safety signals. And so that was an experience before. And then realizing that, it's the whole post-market, and the people who approve the drugs are the same people that are responsible for looking at safety. So that seemed like a conflict of interest. But when I got on the FDA advisory committee, I'm actually, my official title is consumer representative. So I represent the general public. And then there can also be a patient rep who might have the disease. But for me, I'm supposed to represent what does it look like in the real world, right? And the voice of the real world. And what I have seen is, the FDA approval, or a lot of the sitting on that, the committee, it's about getting the drug on the market and not so much about the safety per se.